The flight deck crew said no pilot can land in these conditions. Zero visibility, 20-foot swells, Category 4 storm battering the carrier. 6 F-22s had already declared emergency and diverted to land bases. Then she keyed her mic from 30,000 feet. "Tower, I'm coming home." What happened next froze every soul on that flight deck and changed naval aviation forever. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If this story resonates with you, consider subscribing for more tales of unrecognized heroes. Remain red. Visibility 00, sustained winds 80 knots gusting to 95. All recovery operations remain suspended. On the flight deck below, Chief Petty Officer Marcus Deck Williams supervised a crew of yellow-shirted aircraft handlers who were struggling to secure the remaining aircraft against the storm. Each plane was chained with multiple tie-downs, but even the massive FA-18 Super Hornets were straining against their restraints as the wind tried to lift them from the deck. The storm had developed with unprecedented speed. What meteorologists had predicted as a manageable weather system had intensified into a Category 4 monster that was now bearing down on the carrier group with winds that made flight operations not just dangerous, but theoretically impossible. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Viper Chen stood in the carrier's primary flight control tower, monitoring radio communications from the 6 F-22 Raptors that had been conducting training exercises when the storm hit. As the senior landing signal officer, she was responsible for guiding aircraft safely back to the deck, but the current conditions exceeded every safety parameter in naval aviation. "Storm King flight, this is Lincoln Tower," Chen transmitted. "Weather conditions remain prohibitive for carrier recovery. You are cleared to divert to Miramar Naval Air Station. Acknowledge." One by one, the F-22 pilots acknowledged the diversion order. These were among the most skilled aviators in the world, flying the most advanced fighter aircraft ever built. But even they recognized the futility of attempting a carrier landing in conditions that had never been successfully navigated. F-22 Phantom, call sign Ghost Rider, was the last aircraft in the formation. Captain Elena Rodriguez had been flying for 12 years, with over 2,500 flight hours and multiple combat deployments. Her service record included test pilot training at Edwards Air Force Base and advanced carrier qualification that had earned her recognition as one of the Navy's most capable aviators. But what her official records didn't show was her unique background before military service. Elena had grown up in Alaska, where her father operated a bush pilot service flying supplies to remote villages in weather conditions that would ground most civilian aircraft. She had learned to fly in environments where instrument approaches were conducted in zero visibility, where crosswinds exceeded aircraft specifications, and where landing on short, unprepared strips in severe weather was a matter of survival rather than choice. "Lincoln Tower, this is Ghost Rider." Elena's voice came through the radio with a calmness that seemed to cut through the storm static. "Request permission to attempt recovery." The primary flight control tower fell silent. Thompson looked at Chen, both of them processing what they had just heard. No pilot had ever successfully landed an F-22 on a carrier in conditions even approaching the current weather parameters. "Ghost Rider? Negative," Thompson responded immediately. "Weather conditions exceed all safety margins. You are directed to divert to Miramar with the rest of your squadron." Elena studied her instruments as her F-22 Raptor flew through the storm at 30,000 feet. Her fuel state was approaching minimum reserves, but she still had enough for one approach attempt. More importantly, she was reading weather conditions that others might not recognize. "Tower, I have some unusual weather indicators up here," Elena transmitted. "The storm system is showing signs of a temporary stability window developing. I believe I can time an approach during a brief calm period." Chen frowned at her weather radar display. The storm showed no signs of abating, with consistent intensity across all altitude levels. "Ghost Rider, we're not seeing any improvement in surface conditions. Sustained winds remain at 80 knots with higher gusts." Elena understood their skepticism. Her observations were based on subtle atmospheric indicators that weren't captured by standard weather radar. Growing up in Alaska, she had learned to read storm patterns through changes in air pressure, wind direction shifts, and cloud formation movements that preceded brief windows of reduced intensity. Tower, I know this is unconventional, but I'm observing pressure gradient changes that suggest a temporary stabilization in approximately 12 minutes. If I time my approach correctly, I should encounter a brief window of reduced surface winds. Thompson consulted with the ship's meteorological officer, who confirmed that weather modeling showed no predicted improvement in conditions. The official forecast called for continued deterioration over the next 6 hours. Ghost Rider, meteorology reports no predicted weather improvement. You are ordered to divert immediately. Elena made a decision that would define her career. Tower, I'm declaring a fuel emergency. I have insufficient fuel to reach Miramar. Request emergency approach clearance. The declaration changed everything. Under emergency conditions, the carrier was obligated to attempt aircraft recovery regardless of weather conditions. Thompson activated emergency protocols while Chief Williams prepared the flight deck crash and rescue teams. Ghost Rider, emergency approach clearance granted, Thompson transmitted grimly. Be advised, deck conditions remain extreme. LSO teams are standing by. Chen moved to her position at the LSO platform, an exposed station on the port side of the flight deck where landing signal officers guided aircraft to safe landings. In normal conditions, the LSO platform provided an unobstructed view of approaching aircraft and clear communication with pilots during the critical final approach phase. But in the current storm, the LSO platform was being battered by hurricane-force winds and driving rain. Chen had to secure herself with safety lines while salt spray from massive waves made visibility nearly impossible. Her radio equipment was protected by waterproof housing, but the conditions made precise communication challenging. Elena began her descent from 30,000 feet, timing her approach to coincide with the weather window she had identified. Her F-22's advanced fly-by-wire systems were designed to provide stability in adverse conditions, but the approaching weather exceeded the parameters that even the most sophisticated aircraft systems could fully compensate for. At 15,000 feet, Elena encountered the outer bands of the storm system. Turbulence immediately became severe, with vertical wind shears that threw the 65,000-pound fighter aircraft around like a toy. Most pilots would have declared the approach unstable and executed a missed approach, but Elena used techniques learned from her Alaska bush pilot background to work with the turbulence rather than fight against it. Tower, Ghost Rider passing 15,000, Elena reported, her voice steady despite the violent aircraft movement. Encountering significant turbulence but maintaining approach profile. Chen watched her radar display as the F-22's radar signature appeared through the storm clutter. Elena's approach was unconventional but consistent, maintaining a steeper than normal glide path that seemed to anticipate the carrier's movement in the heavy seas. Ghost Rider, you're looking high and fast, Chen transmitted. Recommend you wave off and attempt divert to alternate field. Negative, Tower. I have the deck in sight and weather conditions are beginning to stabilize as predicted. Elena was right. The storm's intensity was showing signs of temporary reduction as competing weather systems created a brief period of reduced wind speeds. It wasn't a calm by any standard definition, but it represented a window of opportunity that might allow for aircraft recovery. At 5,000 feet, Elena could see the carrier through breaks in the storm clouds. The massive ship was still pitching heavily in the swells, but the deck movement was following a predictable pattern that she could time her approach to match. Chief Williams positioned his flight deck crew for emergency recovery operations. Yellow-shirted aircraft handlers stood ready with arresting gear, while red-shirted ordnance personnel prepared for potential crash response. The entire flight deck operation was focused on the single F-22, attempting an approach that everyone considered impossible. Ghost Rider, call the ball, Chen transmitted, requesting Elena to confirm visual contact with the optical landing system that provided glide path guidance. Ghost Rider has the ball. Fuel state 2.1, Elena responded, indicating she could see the Fresnel lens optical landing system and had enough fuel for this single approach attempt. The final approach phase required Elena to land her F-22 on a moving platform that was pitching up and down through a 30-foot range while rolling side to side. The arresting cables that would stop her aircraft were moving in 3 dimensions, creating a target zone that was constantly changing position. Elena used bush pilot techniques developed for landing on frozen lakes in crosswinds to adjust her approach. Instead of fighting the aircraft movement, she worked with the turbulence patterns, using wind shears and downdrafts to maintain her glide path toward the deck. "Looking good, Ghost Rider," Chen called out as Elena's F-22 approached the ramp. "You're on glide path, on centerline." The final seconds of approach required Elena to time her touchdown to coincide with the carrier deck's upward motion, ensuring that her aircraft would contact the deck when it was moving toward her rather than away. This timing demanded split-second precision and an intuitive understanding of the ship's movement pattern. Elena's F-22 touched down precisely on the centerline, her tailhook catching the number 3 arresting wire and bringing the fighter to a controlled stop in less than 300 feet. The landing was so smooth that observers later described it as the most precise carrier recovery they had ever witnessed under any conditions. The flight deck erupted in cheers that could be heard over the storm winds. Chief Williams and his crew secured Elena's aircraft with record speed, recognizing that they had just witnessed something that would be discussed in naval aviation circles for decades. Thompson keyed his radio with something approaching disbelief. "Ghost Rider, welcome aboard. That was the most outstanding piece of flying I've ever seen." Elena shut down her engines and opened her canopy to Pacific storm winds that were still gusting over 70 knots. As she climbed down from her aircraft, flight deck personnel gathered around her with expressions that mixed admiration with amazement. "Captain Rodriguez," Chief Williams said, extending his hand. "That was impossible flying, ma'am. How did you read those weather conditions?" Elena removed her helmet, her hair immediately whipped by the storm winds still raging across the flight deck. "Chief, when you grow up flying in Alaska bush country, you learn that impossible weather is just another word for challenging conditions." Chen approached from the LSO platform, still secured by safety lines against the continuing storm. "Captain, I've been guiding aircraft to this deck for 8 years. I've never seen approach control like that. Where did you learn to read storm patterns that precisely?" "My father taught me that weather systems always have patterns," Elena replied. "Even the most chaotic storms have brief moments of relative stability. You just have to know how to recognize them and time your approach accordingly." Word of Elena's impossible landing spread throughout the carrier immediately. Captain Robert Hayes, the ship's commanding officer, arrived on the flight deck within minutes to personally congratulate Elena on accomplishing what every aviation expert had declared impossible. "Captain Rodriguez," Hayes said, extending his hand, "I've been in naval aviation for 26 years. What you just accomplished will be studied at every flight school in the Navy. How do we learn from what you did here?" Elena looked around at the assembled flight deck crew, all of whom had witnessed her landing and were eager to understand the techniques that had made it possible. "Sir, it's not about fighting adverse conditions. It's about reading them and working with them. Every storm has a rhythm, and every ship has a movement pattern. When you can synchronize with both, even extreme weather becomes manageable." Commander Thompson descended from primary flight control to join the group gathering around Elena. "Captain, I need to understand your weather analysis. You predicted a stability window that our meteorological equipment didn't detect." "Commander, standard weather instruments measure average conditions over broad areas," Elena explained. "But local weather phenomena create micro patterns that can be read if you know what to look for. I learned to recognize these patterns flying in Alaska, where weather changes can happen in minutes and missing the signs means not coming home." Over the following hours, as the storm continued to batter the carrier, Elena worked with the ship's meteorological officers and flight operations personnel to document the techniques she had used. Her approach to reading atmospheric conditions represented a completely different methodology from standard Navy procedures. Lieutenant Commander Chen was particularly interested in Elena's timing methods. "Captain, you synchronized your approach with both the weather pattern and the ship's movement. How do you calculate those variables simultaneously?" "It's not calculation," Elena replied. "It's pattern recognition. When you've landed on frozen lakes where the wind is shifting every few seconds, you develop an intuitive sense for timing. You feel the rhythm rather than compute it." The storm finally began to abate 6 hours later, allowing normal flight operations to resume. By then, news of Elena's impossible landing had reached Pacific Fleet headquarters and was generating interest at the highest levels of Naval Aviation Command. Admiral Patricia Morrison, commander of Naval Air Forces Pacific, arrived by helicopter the following morning to personally debrief Elena. The meeting took place on the flight deck, with the calm Pacific stretching to the horizon under clear skies that made the previous day's storm seem like a distant memory. "Captain Rodriguez," Admiral Morrison said, "your landing yesterday has generated significant attention throughout the naval aviation community. I need to understand what happened here and how we can incorporate your techniques into our training programs." Elena gestured toward the flight deck where normal aircraft operations were proceeding under perfect weather conditions. "Admiral, what happened yesterday wasn't about special techniques. It was about applying bush pilot fundamentals to carrier aviation. The principles are the same whether you're landing on a frozen lake in Alaska or a carrier deck in a Pacific storm." Morrison studied Elena carefully. "Captain, I've reviewed your service record. Your performance has always been exceptional, but nothing in your training explains what you accomplished yesterday. Where did these skills come from?" "My father, Admiral. He flew supplies to remote Alaskan villages in conditions that would ground most pilots. Growing up in that environment, you learn that weather is never a barrier, just a variable to be managed." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Commander James Mitchell, a test pilot from the Navy's Top Gun school who had flown out to interview Elena about her techniques. Mitchell represented the elite of naval aviation, with over 3,000 flight hours and experience testing experimental aircraft under extreme conditions. "Captain Rodriguez," Mitchell said, "I've reviewed the flight data from your approach yesterday. The aircraft performance parameters you achieved should not have been possible under those weather conditions. How do you explain the discrepancy?" Elena smiled. "Commander, aircraft performance specifications are based on standard operating procedures, but aircraft are capable of much more when you understand how to work with environmental forces rather than against them." Mitchell frowned. "Can you elaborate on that?" "Sure. When you encounter turbulence, standard procedure is to fight through it with control inputs that maintain straight and level flight. But turbulence has patterns, and if you learn to read those patterns, you can use the energy of the disturbed air to help maintain your flight path." The concept was revolutionary for pilots trained in conventional techniques. Elena spent the next several hours demonstrating her methods using flight simulators that replicated the conditions she had encountered during her approach. Admiral Morrison observed the training sessions with growing interest. "Captain, these techniques represent a fundamentally different approach to adverse weather flying. I want to establish a formal program to evaluate and potentially incorporate these methods into Navy training curricula." Elena nodded. "Admiral, I'd be honored to participate in such a program, but I should mention that these techniques require a different mindset from standard aviation training. They're based on intuitive response to environmental conditions rather than procedural compliance." 3 months later, Elena was reassigned to the Navy's test pilot school at Patuxent River, where she began developing a new curriculum that combined traditional naval aviation training with the environmental awareness techniques she had learned in Alaska. The program attracted the attention of pilots throughout the Navy and Air Force, many of whom had encountered situations where conventional training proved inadequate for extreme weather conditions. Elena's methods offered an alternative approach that emphasized adaptation and environmental awareness over procedural rigidity. Captain Hayes visited the program 6 months after Elena's impossible landing to observe training exercises that simulated extreme weather carrier approaches. "Captain Rodriguez, what you've developed here is changing how we think about pilot training throughout the Navy." Elena watched a student pilot successfully execute a simulated approach in conditions that would have been considered impossible under previous training standards. "Captain, what we're really teaching is that limitations are often assumptions rather than facts. When you change your approach to environmental challenges, you discover that many barriers are actually opportunities." The program Elena developed became known throughout naval aviation as weather warrior training, though Elena herself preferred the simpler designation of Alaska method. Pilots who completed the program reported significantly improved performance in adverse weather conditions and greater confidence in challenging environmental situations. Commander Mitchell, who had initially been skeptical of Elena's techniques, became one of the program's strongest advocates after completing the training himself. Captain Rodriguez showed us that expertise comes in many forms, he told new students. Sometimes, the most valuable knowledge comes from sources outside traditional military training. Elena continued teaching at Patuxent River for 2 years before returning to fleet operations as an air wing commander. Her impossible landing during the Pacific storm became a case study taught at every naval aviation school. And the techniques she developed influenced pilot training throughout the Navy. But Elena herself remained focused on the practical application of her methods rather than the recognition they brought. Weather is never the enemy, she told her students. It's just another factor to be understood and worked with. When you stop fighting the environment and start cooperating with it, impossible becomes inevitable. From the storm-battered flight deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln to training facilities throughout the Navy, Elena Rodriguez's story became a reminder that true expertise often comes from unexpected sources. Her background as an Alaska bush pilot's daughter had provided insights that conventional military training could not match. The techniques she developed saved lives and aircraft in situations where traditional methods would have failed. More importantly, her approach demonstrated that innovation in military aviation could come from embracing rather than rejecting unconventional sources of knowledge. Because sometimes, the most sophisticated training is no match for someone who learned to fly where impossible weather was just another Tuesday morning.